Good afternoon. My name is George Washington, and I'm very aware that our country is faced with some difficult times, and we are kept from one another's presence. And as some of you may know, I have recently made it known that I am stepping away from this office and will let another man hold the position of President of our United States of America. Whoever we elect to this position will lead us in the future as we continue to grow and to recover and see life return as normal. But it was my hope that we might take this opportunity, that we might share one another's experiences, that I might be able to make myself available for whatever questions or concerns you may have regarding these last 8 years of the presidency, or those matters of the past before that time that has brought us to this place, or anything else, I suppose, of a public nature to which I might provide answer. Please, if you have any questions, be so kind as to ask them.
Thank you, President Washington. We do have a question of why are you not willing to serve a third term as president?
I'm asked why I'm not willing to stand for election a third time to continue in this office. The truth of the matter is I never wished to hold this position in the first place. I had stated over and over again when I served in command of the Army that I did not intend for any personal gain. How will I be viewed by posterity now that I have taken such an office as President of these United States? I also have enough of my own personal concerns. My own estate was suffering in the occasion, and I'm old. And while my enemies state that I show all signs of aging, and while my friends state that I show none, I assure you that the truth lay somewhere betwixt the two.
Thank you. Elizabeth asks, why did you prefer Hamilton's assistance to Burr's during the Revolutionary War?
I'm asked my preference to Colonel Hamilton as my secretary during the war over Major Burr, who served for a small period of time in my military family. Some of it were due to the character, but one must understand Alexander Hamilton has incredible abilities. He's an excellent penman, and I've always endeavored to surround myself by men who are excellent penmen, well educated. I personally suffer a deficiency of education and relied a great deal on my military family previously and now upon my cabinet to aid in providing me good counsel. And the truth of the matter is I found the counsel of Colonel Hamilton more useful. In fact, that's one of the reasons why he later found himself as Secretary of the Treasury.
Now Emma asks, continuing on your military family, what was your relationship with the Marquis de Lafayette like?
The Marquis is a good friend. When he first arrived in the military camp, I had no idea what to do with the young boy. He was only 19 years of age. He'd been given the position of Major General, but no men under his command, and no experience as general. I had no idea what use to make of him. And I brought him, as you say, into the military family. I made him an aide-de-camp. He could have easily have been offended by this. Aide-de-camps are usually colonels or majors. They're not major generals. And I took him on a tour of our lines and asked him what he thought of the position of our artillery. And his response was, I did not come to teach you, but to learn from you. Let me assure you, no other foreign officer who joined our cause has ever said that. Since then, of course, our friendship has only grown ever the closer. And I will admit to you, when I last saw the Marquis back in '84, when he came to visit our country, and we parted, our parting brought a tear to my eye. I feared then and wondered whether I'd ever see him again. My heart says that I will, but my mind, in all honesty, says I probably will not. I miss him greatly.
Speaking of those that you love, Amy has asked, how is your beautiful wife?
Thank you, Amy, for asking about my dear wife, who is, as you say, very beautiful. I have done far better in a choice of a suitable consort than many men have done. I am fortunate that my wife would have me. She could have chosen many other men far better than myself. And we have become a very suitable partnership. She is my most worthy of friends. In fact, we find ourselves in agreement in most matters, all but perhaps two. I wish she showed a little bit more discipline in the raising of her children, and she would rather that I didn't let the dogs in the house.
President Washington, Greg has asked, which one of the two positions, president or commander of the army, did you find most challenging and life-changing?
It's a very good question. So they both have had their challenges, and they have both changed my life to different degrees. The difficulty with the present position, with President of the United States, is not only have I never held such an office, but neither has anyone else. Every step I take is on untrodden ground, and every step I take creates precedent, whether it's an intended precedent or whether it is not. Serving as general, certainly there were difficulties in that matter as well, not the least of which was our lack of resources, our inability to gain money, our want of material of war. But these were all matters I had dealt with before when I was a colonel in the war, when France was our enemy and England our friend. But the circumstances of the president were all new to me.
Laurel asks, do you feel that your administration has done enough to ensure national unity?
I wish that I could say that is true. We have unfortunately in these last few years seen an increase of division in our country. We have seen a rise of faction. We've seen the wealthy against the poor and vice versa, the North against the South, the East against the West, the farmer against the mercantile interests. And perhaps the worst of all of these matters, we have seen the introduction of political parties. The alternating domination of one political party over another, spurred on by the spirit of revenge, will always serve to drive a nation further and further from its better interests in greater councils. It causes a man not to be a servant to his nation, but nothing more than a servant to a political party.
Moving on to a bit of a lighter topic, several of our friends watching right now have asked questions about your domestic life, in particular, where you keep your dogs and if you have any children.
I have never been blessed with any children of my own. My wife, on the other hand, when we first married, she had two children who had survived. They since have been taken from us, but her boy had 4 children. And 2 of those we have raised as if they are our own and live with us. And that has been a benefit, made up for, to some degree, the lack of my own children. As to the dogs, I feel uncomfortable having a question about dogs placed along the question of my children. The dogs, for the most part, particularly the foxhounds, live in kennels just outside the house. Not close enough to the house for my preference, but far too close for my wife's. There is a small dog that her granddaughter has, which is within the house, but most of the dogs stay without most of the year. And we have one particular dog that may interest you. We have a French staghound. I was asked earlier about my friend, the Marquis de Lafayette. He gave me this staghound. His name is Vulcan. And Vulcan, I don't know if you're familiar with staghound's law, but they are just about, what would you say, about kitchen table height. One Christmas, Vulcan helped himself. He got into our kitchen and he helped himself to the ham. Just lifted it right off the table. My wife was incensed. You never seen so much anger in women. And I couldn't stop from laughing on the other end of the table. In fact, the angrier she got, and my laughter only made her angrier, just caused me to laugh all the more.
Sir, somebody seems to know about your stables and has asked how Royal Gift is faring.
I'm asked regarding my Jack. One of the things that impressed me in the late war were the mules. And I think there's a future for mules in our country. I've been endeavoring to improve the American mule since then. And in the process, I have received originally a gift of 2 mules. pardon, 2 Jacks, only one of which arrived alive, and that is Royal Gift. Truth is, he's been disappointing. Royal Gift apparently knows that he was the gift from the King of Spain, and with that in mind, he has lofty opinions of himself and finds our American mayors too plebeian or common for his interests.
Jamie asks, sir, were you surprised that you were picked to be president?
I cannot say that I was surprised. My wife and I both hoped that another man might be taken, chosen for the position. As I said earlier, I did not wish the position. But it became apparent very quickly that the nation did. And no matter of my own personal preference would allow me to be left aside to remain at home. I would have preferred another man had been chosen. But in the end, when the vote of the Electoral College were taken, every member of that body used one of their 2 votes for me. In fact, on both of the elections, I was elected to that position unanimously. That was a surprise. And we were taught by the Stoics that the greatest honor that any man may hope to achieve is recognition by his neighbors and virtuous countrymen for service to his nation. I would rather have stayed at home and not be made president, but I do acknowledge the great honor that has been done me by having been chosen by the people of the United States.
Thinking about the last 8 years, sir, Tara asks, what is your greatest concern as you hand leadership of the country to a new president?
Questions regarding what matters do I find most troubling and challenging to our future. I mentioned one of them earlier, the rise of factions. We must learn to put behind us our local pursuits, our contracted policies, and our absurd, petty jealousies of one another. And we must remember that those matters that bind us together as one are far more important than those matters that keep us divided. We speak the same language, we worship the same God, and we enjoy the same political principles and customs.
Melanie asks, sir, along that same line, what is the best way to lead our new nation as far as setting up a government for the people?
Well, we have adopted these last 8 years now what I think has been the most successful system of government we were likely to have produced under our present Constitution. Oh, I agree. I understand your question. There are perhaps some faults with our Constitution. I do not doubt that it is not perfect. But I assure you that no more perfect government could possibly have been created at this epoch. And if there are some matters that need be altered or changed, well, see, that is now your responsibility, not ours. For government does not belong to those men who created it. It belongs to those who use it. We purposely have left means by which this system of government may be altered and changed. It's not my common custom to quote my former Secretary of the State, but as it is his birthday, and in his honor, perhaps I should share with you the words he stated in this matter, which is that you cannot expect a man to wear at the age of 40 the same clothing that he wore when he was 14. In same fact, our systems of government belong not to those who created it, but rather to those who use it.
Thank you, sir. Speaking of several members of your cabinet, we have been asked by several people your thoughts on Mr. Hamilton, as well as Mr. Adams.
Well, Secretary Hamilton, I still rely on him greatly, even though he has stepped away from his position as Secretary of the Treasury. In fact, recently I have made known, as I said when I began, that I'm leaving this office. It has always been my practice to write a valedictory address, a farewell address. I think I also mentioned that I suffer a deficiency of education. When I say write, I mean more oft I hire some other gentleman, better educated, to actually apply his pen to paper, to take my thoughts and give me better words. When I first intended to step away from this office 4 years ago, I had Mr. Madison do so. But now, of course, Mr. Madison is now no longer my friend. So instead, my present farewell address has been penned by Mr. Hamilton, which I think says the great affection and respect that I have for that man. Who else? They asked about another gentleman.
Mr. Adams.
Oh, of course, my vice president. It is my intention not to speak in favor or against any of the gentlemen who will make themselves known as my possible replacements. As Mr. Adams has already stood election on 2 occasions previously, I do not doubt that he will do so a 3rd time. And I do not know how I can state my opinions regarding the gentleman without breaking that first agreement.
Sir, continuing on speaking about your presidency, Misty asks, did you enjoy the first year of your presidency in New York?
I don't know that enjoy is the right word. As I think I mentioned, I didn't wish the position at all. However, I was glad that New York were chosen. And the reason for that, what was the obvious choice? The obvious choice is where we later met, where we are meeting now, in Philadelphia. The advantage to New York is that New York was too far north. There was no way that New York would remain the capital of our United States. Philadelphia might have. And I'm very much of the opinion that our federal government must find its seat in a national city, a new federal city that is built specifically to the needs, not one that is beholden to any of our previous cities or of its states for that matter. I'm glad to say that we are engaged presently in finally fulfilling that portion of the Constitution. The groundwork has been laid, the cornerstone has been set for the Capitol building, and construction is underway. In only a few years' time, our government will once again be removing itself. This time, not to New York or Philadelphia, but it shall regain and meet together in the new national city along the Potomac.
Thank you, sir. We've had several questions about your years serving as Commander-in-Chief. Denise asks, how long did you think the war would last? And did it last longer than you thought it would?
It did. I wrote to my wife when I first made General and Commander-in-Chief. That was in June, back in '75. And I wrote to her that I hoped that I would be home by Christmas time. And I was. 8 years later, the war did last longer than I had expected. And then when it came to a conclusion, it did so somewhat without my expectation. When we were engaged against Cornwallis at York, I knew we were on the verge of an important victory. Anytime the enemy finds itself in the circumstance that Cornwallis was in, besieged with no ability to be resupplied or resupported or to escape, it's only a matter of time till he'd be forced to surrender. I knew that would occur, but what took me by surprise is I did not know that it would cause the end of the war. Oh, it still took another 2 years before the war came to its complete conclusion, before the politicians agreed to the final treaty. But that treaty came about because of our victory at Yorktown. I mean, I did not expect that at all.
Continuing on about your service, Pat asks, I've heard you employed spies during the war. Is this true?
Absolutely true. Both our side and the enemy made use of spies, though I think we were perhaps more successful in that use than the enemy were. Not so much in the beginning. We made incredible mistakes when we first began. We didn't know what we were doing, but soon we improved, and we managed to not only use spies to gain intelligence of our enemy's intentions and their movements, but we also found many occasions which we could give them the information we wanted them to receive, where we could give them false information that we might take advantage of our own circumstances. Well, we certainly did rely upon spies.
This might be a sensitive subject, President Washington, but Laura has asked how disappointed you were upon learning about Benedict Arnold's betrayal.
This is all I will say about the traitor. When I was marching to Yorktown, down from New York. I was asked by one of my officers, do I think that the traitor ever suffers pangs of conscience from the decisions that he's made? Let me assure you, I do not believe that he does, because the blood that flows in his veins is just as black as any demon's. Therefore, he's unable to feel such sensitive emotion. I was surprised by the crimes committed by the traitor, as were, I think, anyone.
Tony asks, sir, that you fought for the British side and then chose to fight for the American side. Why did you switch?
It's true, I fought as a lieutenant colonel in the war against France. And, well, we were British. We were subjects of the king. We thought, all the rights that we were entitled to in the position as subjects of the crown. But as time comes to pass, first with the Stamp Act, and then the Townsend duties, and then shots being fired at Lexington and Concord, it became more and more certain that we were considered something less than an English subject. Even our matters of agriculture and how the market were viewed, we were not on an equal footing with England. We were not viewed as full members of the empire. And finally, when October came, October of 75, and we learned that the king had now declared us outside of his protection and raised the king's standard against us, that was too much. When I first took command of the Continental Army, when I arrived in Cambridge in July, we were still fighting to defend our rights as freeborn British subjects. We were still hoping for reconciliation. But by the end of that year, I was very much of the opinion that there was no end that could occur, no satisfactory and virtuous peace that may be had that did not include independence. We didn't ask for that war. Sad it is to reflect that the brother's sword was sheathed in a brother's breast, and that these once peaceable plains would be drenched with blood or inhabited by slaves.
Beth asks, were you surprised at the success of the Southern campaign?
I was very surprised. For those of you who are not aware, we had suffered a disaster. We had seen Savannah fall, we had seen Charleston taken. Our Southern army seemed on the verge of complete annihilation. And a desperate circumstance, I put the second in command of our army, General Nathaniel Greene, under command of the Southern Army. And matters changed. Instead of simply facing defeat after defeat, we started to gain victories. In fact, if it weren't for victories that were had in the Carolinas, we would never have had our victory at Yorktown. It's a shame that General Greene, who's since been taken from us, finds his estate in such an embarrassing circumstance. It seems the curse of a free nation that it'll always be a small number of its population that is engaged in its defense. But when that majority refuses to pay the debts that it is owed to its soldiers, that is unforgivable.
David asks, sir, would you ever consider putting the uniform back on to defend this country?
I hope I'm never called to do so, David. I am old. I resigned my commission as General and Commander-in-Chief back in '83 with no intention of ever finding myself in that position again. I say that. I did march at the head of our armies to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. But beyond that matter, I hope that it never occurs. I hope that no later president feels the need to call me back.
Thank you, sir. We have a few questions from some younger audience members. Savannah Grace, age 8, wants to know, who was your best friend as a child?
As a child? That wasn't what I was expecting. Normally, I would answer that question by referring to my dear wife and my neighbor, George William Fairfax. I would argue that my greatest friends, it's hard to call them simply friends because they were, in fact, my brothers, and also acted as my mentors. My brother Lawrence, for instance, fulfilled the role as father to me. My father was taken when I was 11 years of age. I owe a great debt to my brother Lawrence for making me the man that I would become.
Mason, who is another young audience member, has asked, what was your dad's name?
My dad's name was Augustine Washington. He was a good man, from what I remember of him, which is little, I fear. He was engaged in the business of foundry work, had large shares in the largest foundry in the colonies at those times. In fact, it's one of the reasons why I don't recall him so well. Not only did he pass when I was young, but that business often took him away from our side and from our home.
Riley asks, what was your proudest moment as president?
I have never been in the practice of taking any credit for myself for what we may have achieved. I will take credit for those failures we have taken. But if we have achieved matters that have ended in a fashion that is pleasing for our nation, I cannot take pride in those because I am not deserving of it. Those belong not to myself, but rather to the generous interposition of an overruling providence. That's where thanks belongs.
In comparison, sir, Laura has now asked, what would you consider the worst part of your presidency?
If you mean by your question, what do I most regret that I have done? I would have to say I was sending my dear friend, Mr. J, as our ambassador to England. We were in great need of a treaty of peace and a trade agreement. And far less were achieved than I would have preferred. And my council and my cabinet, many of them stated that I should send another man and that my dear friend, Mr. J, were not properly prepared and able for the task. I usually do listen to counsel, but in this case I sent my friend. And he was outmaneuvered by those more experienced English gentlemen. I understand that his treaty has caused a great difficulty and disappointment in our nation. Let me assure you that there has not been any controversy. We have not engaged in any improper actions with the English. He has simply been outmaneuvered.
Thank you, sir. Kevin asks your thoughts on how newspapers covered your presidency.
Oh, newspapers. You know, there were two newspapers that were created just with the intention of attacking my administration. And let me tell you this, one of them I am pretty certain was being supported by a member of our administration. I'm speaking, of course, of Furneaux's paper and Benjamin Franklin Bosch's paper. These two newspapers have done nothing but attack our administration for every decision that we have made over and over again. But let me tell you this. I've also kept my subscription to those papers. Well, Bosch's is gone now, but still to Furneaux's. And I will do so until I step away from this office. Our freedom of the press is the bulwark in which all of the rest of our freedoms lay. Without it, then we will all be led like lambs to the slaughter.
Thank you, sir. Continuing on in your time as president, Brian asks if you could speak to the differences between Mr. Hamilton and Mr. Jefferson concerning a centralized national bank.
Well, we do have, of course, a federal bank. And that was the opinion and the creation of Mr. Hamilton. By that, I mean the idea of it, because, of course, it was put into effect by an act of the legislature, as any act must be. The Mr. Jefferson, in general, is suspicious of all banks, and he is fearful and is of the opinion that the general bank is not supported by the Constitution. This, and he and I see differently in that matter. I'm very much of the opinion if the Constitution even hints that you cannot do something, then you cannot do it. But if it doesn't mention it, it doesn't have to state you can to be able to do it. And there's a very valuable benefit that the federal bank has given us, and that is the ability to borrow from our future earnings. When I took this office, our national government was, if you can imagine this, $7 million in debt. And that's not to mention the state's debts, which have since been assumed by the federal government, raising that matter now to what, $27 million. The reason for this debt, in no small part, was because of the late war and our inability to provide for ourselves by borrowing from our future earnings, which is exactly what this bank allows for. I do not think that we can attest to our security long without it. One of the most important pillars of our security and safety is our public credit. For public credit to be preserved, of course, the best means is to avoid spending it unnecessarily. But when one finds themselves in a situation such as a necessary war, then those debts must be paid, and never left ungenerously to be paid by our children or our children's children. And the bank helps provide for that.
Thank you, sir. Kurt has asked, history has painted you in a very favorable light. Do you think that it is justified?
I hope that it might be, Kurt. As I said earlier, the greatest thing that a man may hope to achieve is recognition by his neighbors and virtuous countrymen for service to his nation. I've always endeavored to be guided by my virtue and by my conscience, but I will leave it to posterity to determine how I should be remembered. If I remembered favorably, then I will be satisfied and pleased, but I cannot sway that matter or make alterations in the public's opinion.
Sir, we've had several questions in regards to your lady. Anne has asked, how do you and Mrs. Washington spend date night? And several other people have asked in regards to your courtship with her.
Well, as to the first question, I think I will have to disappoint you. Our home has become a well-resorted tavern, even before the presidency, ever since the conclusion of the war, with everybody traveling either north, south, or east and west, feeling the need to visit us at our home. I think my wife and I have only been together alone some 4 times since the conclusion of the late war. So I wish I had more opportunities that I might enjoy, what did you put it, a date night with my wife. As to the other matter, back when we were freer in that regard, I had known the widow Custis for some time, but our courtship begun entirely by, well, I'm going to say by an accident. It was an accident on our part, but the matter were entirely arranged by friends and neighbors of my wife, the Chamberlains. They arranged for us to meet unexpectedly to ourselves. And I will admit, I think we were both very uncomfortable when that matter begun and we found ourselves in those circumstances. But once we got beyond that, once we got to know one another, it was a different matter entirely. I was quickly enamored with my lowland beauty. And in fact, we found ourselves engaged to be married, and were married, 6 months after. I have never regretted that decision. My wife has helped carry me through not only 8 long years of war, but now this 8 years of the presidency as well. She has not wished for this any more than I did. In fact, she will not appreciate me sharing this with you. Don't tell her that I said this. But she feels very much as if she is in a political prison at present. I think she will be even happier for my retirement than I shall be.
I think that she would agree with you, sir. Walter asks, and several others have as well, if you enjoy being a Mason.
I am proud to be considered a brother. So I was made a Mason when I was 20 years of age at Lodge Number 4, Fredericksburg. For a long time, I couldn't be very active because I stopped living in Fredericksburg and there wasn't a lodge closer to my home. Did participate in some lodge activities during the war. We had some traveling lodges which traveled with us. And then, of course, shortly after the Alexandria Lodge were commissioned, I'm chartered worshipful master of that lodge. I found myself made president. So again, I've been removed from that position. I'm very honored to be considered a brother by that fraternity. A fraternity that I think its beliefs and concepts and tenets are entirely in line with that of a young republic.
Sir, we have several more questions about your service during the late war. Asher, age 10, asks, did your experience in the war with the French prepare you for the battlefield situations you found yourself in during the Revolution?
It did, Asher. The only experience that a soldier has, well, the only training a soldier gets is by way of experience. He learns in the field. This is true not only of our army, though I hope to change that, but also of the British. See, the French have an advantage on us. The French have military academies, and it is a long time, I think, that we create such a thing here as well, that we might better educate young officers. But my experience as a soldier, how to lead men, not only how to lead men in the field in all those military aspects that you would normally assume, but also how to provide for men with a lack of support and want of money. I learned those things in that war as well.
John asks, sir, how were you able to keep up morale among the soldiers with defeats suffered early on and lack of basic supplies?
Not as well as I would have preferred, sir. We had difficulties with desertion throughout the war. In fact, I was forced to rely upon the advantages that martial law gives in punishing such crimes to endeavor to try to stop them, but to no avail. We also endeavored into other opportunities to try to raise the men's spirits, to see their pay fulfilled. It was almost always in arrears. To provide bounties on occasion, extra monies to them. In winter camps, it wasn't unusual for us to put upon presentations and shows and plays. In fact, my wife was instrumental in some of that in one of the most difficult of our camps. And occasionally we sought victories in the field for no other reason but to raise the men's spirits. It's not by some accident that on Christmas Eve that we crossed the Delaware and took a regiment of Hessians at Trenton. Trenton, it didn't provide us some great advantage by its position or strategic value. The whole purpose is that we might have a victory because we had suffered nothing but defeat since August of that year. We were driven out of New York City, we were driven out of the state of New York, all the way through New Jersey and into Pennsylvania, failure after failure after failure, and the men's enlistments were just about to expire. Now, don't get me wrong, Trenton itself, the intention was simply to raise the men's spirits, but it ended up over the next 10 days giving us one of the most important victories we would have in the war, not by my original intentions. And that was our victory at Princetown.
Nancy asks, sir, did women play a role in the war beyond waiting at home for their husbands, sons, and fathers?
They did. But I would first state that waiting at home was not unsupportive in the first point. There were many whose husbands, brothers, fathers, and sons were engaged in the war. And this could only be done with the support of the women who remained behind. But many of those women were also forced by the needs of the circumstance to step outside of their usual compass and take upon themselves responsibilities that in happier times could be avoided. Their shops needed to continue to produce. Their farms still needed to be farmed. But there were women in the field with us as well. It wasn't unusual for some soldiers' wives to join with the army. We had more in truth than we could allow for, which caused some difficulty of food and logistics. These women would provide important value to the army, mostly as laundresses. But on occasions, some of them took upon themselves even greater authority. There were occasions where women took up the position of their husbands when they fell on the field. Not that we expected that, nor in fact wanted it. There were even some women, if you can believe this, who disguised themselves as men and shouldered muskets just as if they were men. That, of course, is forbidden by the laws of war. And when they were found out, they would be turned out of camp. But I know of one woman who never was found out, who only freely admitted to it afterwards. And the Congress has honored her pension.
So we have several questions in regards to some of your military family. In particular, your thoughts about your relationships with the Swamp Fox, the Marquis de Lafayette, and Hercules Mulligan.
I already spoke to some degree regarding the Marquis de Lafayette, who is a dear, dear friend, still not just as my Major General during the war. I would take offense at one of the comments that were given. I think you mean General Marion, not by some slang term. I don't really know General Marion all that well, but he provided some ability under General Greene during the war in the South. And for some time, it was about the only success we were having in the South before General Greene's arrival, when Charleston fell. One of the few matters that kept the war alive in that place, in that time, were the actions of then Colonel Marion.
The other one was about Hercules Mulligan, sir.
I don't really have much to add again about Mr. Mulligan.
Chelsea has asked, sir, that you survived smallpox, but do you have any advice for a country dealing with an epidemic?
I do. I did have the unfortunate circumstance, or perhaps fortunate in the end, of suffering from smallpox when I was in Barbados in my youth. But the Army suffered from it greatly during the war. Now, smallpox has the advantage. It's one of those illnesses that does not reoccur. If you have it once, you are safe from it. And it's for that very reason that we could practice inoculation to prevent smallpox. My family, for instance, my wife and her children, they were inoculated against the illness. And in the end, at Valley Forge, we inoculated the entire army. I was reluctant to take that action, not because I'm superstitious against the inoculation, which I know many are, but because it debilitates the soldiers. And it could put us at risk. What if the enemy would learn that we were in the process of inoculating? In the end, the decision was made to divide the army into thirds. And 1/3 at a time were inoculated. And that is an advantage with that particular illness, but more recently we have suffered from more challenging illnesses. In fact, back in '93, Philadelphia suffered from the yellow fever. And at present, there is no inoculation for that illness. It's unfortunate that many of us left the city, myself included. I had planned to leave long before the epidemic had even begun. In hindsight, I wish I'd remained to try to raise the morale of those who could not leave, who were forced to remain within the city. I'll tell you one disadvantage I saw during that circumstance, though. I've been asked several times about my former secretary, Colonel Hamilton. Colonel Hamilton suffered from the yellow fever, and his doctor cured him. And he went and spoke publicly about the great work done by his doctor. The difficulty this caused is that the doctor who were doing most of the work in Philadelphia was Benjamin Rush. Now, I only mention any of this because Hamilton is a Federalist, and Benjamin Rush is one of these new Democratic Republicans. And their doctors, Rush's system and Hamilton's system were entirely different on how to treat these men. And very quickly, it became a matter of political divide, which method should be used. In times of great disorder, particularly of illness, one must not allow politics to get in the way of our curing. We must see what are the greater good of the nation and not to the greater good of our political parties.
Thank you, sir. We've had several people ask you what your favorite food is.
Fish. I prefer all manners of seafood. Some part is simply because I enjoy the flavor, but also because I suffer some deficiency with my teeth.
Sir, this is our second to last question, but Haley, age 11, asks, if you could go back and change one mistake that you have made, what mistake would that be?
Haley, if I could change one thing about the past, when they came and asked me if I were willing to stand for office as President of these United States, I would say no.
Thank you, sir. I think we have only time for one more question. And that question is, what do you see as the future of our United States?
I believe that we are from here forward to be viewed as players on the most conspicuous of stages. One that seems destined by Providence for displays of human greatness and felicity. As I mentioned earlier, our systems of government, they are not perfect. And our conditions are not always perfect. And we will always find ourselves suffering on occasion from great disorders, ailments, matters of crisis and emergency that we did not call for, nor that we expected. But we must always continue to take, as we have ever done, whatever Providence will give us. It is certainly time that we continue to put our spirits and our fortitudes to the greatest of tests. We will continue on. I look forward to the day, in fact, when our present matters are behind us, and that we can once again walk the streets of the former capital of Virginia, the Colonial Williamsburg. I hope that you will join me here in those happy days to come.